Dr. Craig, there is an article in Scientific American. It was just written in November of 2015 by John Horgan, a science writer. The name of the article is Lawrence Krauss, a physicist or just a bad philosopher? I say the answer to that is yes. But anyway, we're going to go through this article. In fact, a couple of articles. Lawrence Krauss continues to be talked about and to have articles in major publications. Physicist Lawrence Krauss, who disparages philosophy, according to John Horgan, acted like a bad philosopher in a recent debate. Now, he's not talking about your debate,
No.
which wasn't so recent, but actually it was with journalist Robert Wright on the origins of the universe, quantum weirdness, and the limits of scientific knowledge. Union Theological Seminary, apparently, is where this was hosted. Although John Horgan says, although the event featured a lot of witty banter, it ended up being more frustrating than fun. Wright asked Krauss to clarify his positions on religion, philosophy, and science, and Krauss kept demanding that Wright define his terms. What does he mean by new atheism, scientism, proselytize, imponderable? When I read that, Bill, I was struck by the fact that Wright apparently brought up the term scientism as something here.
Yeah, and the experience this Robert Wright apparently had with Krauss at Union makes me smile because it is so reminiscent of our three dialogues in Australia. Rather than answer the question, he keeps pressing, well, define what you mean by universe, or define your terms. And this is a way of avoiding answering the question, is by just continuing to demand definition of terms rather than to address the question.
Horgan continues, when Wright sought to summarize the book's thesis, Krauss interrupted him once again, saying, you're making it more complicated than it has to be. Imagine that, Krauss interrupted
him, my.
Krauss then launched into an extremely complicated, rambling disquisition on the meaning of nothing. Wright, exasperated, blurted out, people are going to leave tonight without knowing what the criticism of your book is if you continue to filibuster. Okay. Since Krauss, John Horgan says, since Krauss can't interrupt me, let me spell out some objections to his book. I'll start with mine, and then he starts relating some of the problems that he had with the book from 3 years ago. When you look over these, Bill, they seem to be the same objections that you had.
Yes.
Decades ago, physicists such as the legendary John Wheeler proposed that according to the probabilistic dictates of quantum field theory, even an apparently perfect vacuum seethes with particles and antiparticles popping into and out of existence. And you've said that many times in your published work. You've quoted other people, other experts in this field who say the same thing. Here's another expert to add to that, and that is the quantum vacuum. The vacuum is not nothing.
Right.
It has what? Rich structure?
Yes, physical structure, and is governed by physical laws. It is not what we mean by the word nothing, which means not anything. The word nothing is a term of universal negation. There's a whole series of words in English like this: no one, nobody, nowhere. They're terms of universal negation, meaning not anyone, not anywhere, not anything. But Krauss treats the word nothing, because it can be the subject of a sentence or the object of a proposition, as a substantive word that refers to something. And he will often use it to refer to the quantum vacuum or to quantum fields or some other quantum physical state.
Well, John Horgan criticizes Dawkins as well. Dawkins continued to write in this afterward. If On the Origin of Species was biology's deadliest blow to supernaturalism, we may come to see A Universe from Nothing by Krauss as the equivalent from cosmology. And John Horgan says, what? Dawkins is comparing the most enduringly profound scientific treatise in history to a pop science book that recycles a bunch of stale ideas from physics and cosmology. So he's actually just saying all this is Dawkins and Krauss's intense hatred of religion.
Yeah.
So let's see what David Albert of Columbia says about Krauss's book in the New York Times. He says, what it comes down to, Bill, is all these elementary particles, the fundamental laws of nature, electromagnetic fields, all these things. He says these laws have no bearing whatsoever on the questions of where the elementary stuff came from. That's still the question, isn't it? Mm-hmm. We can describe laws, we can describe all these elementary particles, we can get it down as small as we can, but it still doesn't talk about where it came from. Isn't that right?
Right. It doesn't answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing, as Dawkins thinks it does, because it is using the word nothing in an equivocal way, not meaning not anything. Why does anything at all exist? It's using it to refer to quantum states, such as quantum fields or quantum vacuum or other physical states. That's the question that Krauss is addressing, and not Leibniz's question, why is there something rather than nothing? The physics doesn't address that kind of metaphysical question. Mm. That's, by the way, why people who respond to Leibniz's argument by saying that science will solve the problem merely show they haven't understood the argument. Leibniz's argument from contingency is a metaphysical argument about why anything at all exists. And that is a question which physics cannot answer, because physics always presumes some sort of physical state, and cannot answer ultimate metaphysical questions, which are about physics rather than part of physics.
In this debate, Wright mentions Albert's scathing review.
I also quoted Albert's review in the dialogues in Australia, and Krauss had no response to it.
Well, here Krauss dismissed Albert as a philosopher who was probably upset by Krauss's jibes about philosophy. Well, as John Horgan says, Albert is indeed a professor of philosophy, but he has a doctorate in physics.
Yeah.
You know,
and is one of the most eminent philosophers of science today, and eminently qualified to address the philosophical issues that Krauss is raising. It's important to understand that these questions that Krauss is addressing are philosophical questions,
yes,
which he, as a physicist, is not especially qualified to address.
And Horgan says, hey, it gets better. Let's talk about what South African physicist George Ellis says. He says, has Krauss's book answered the question posed by its subtitle? Ellis said, certainly not. He is presenting untested speculative theories of how things came into existence out of a pre-existing complex of entities, and so on and so forth. He does not explain in what way these entities could have pre-existed the coming into being of the universe. And on the next page, Bill, he says, how indeed can you test what existed before the universe existed? You can't. And all of this, I think, is to say that identifying the behavior and the nature of some of these elementary particles, even down to the quantum level, says nothing about where they came from, or whether they came into being, or whether they're eternal or not, and things like that.
Yes, that's right. I think, as David Albert points out, physics is always a physics of some sort of physical state of affairs, even on the quantum physical level, such as quantum fields. And it doesn't answer the ultimate question, why does anything at all exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? That's Leibniz's question. And that is not addressed by equivocating on the meaning of the word nothing.
John Horgan says, when I mentioned Ellis's critique to Krauss, he claimed that Ellis, although once a physicist, is now a theologian.
Yeah, that's just so irresponsible. I mean, here he dismisses David Albert as a philosopher, and now he'll dismiss George Ellis, who is probably the greatest living cosmologist, as a theologian.
Bill, that's so inappropriate.
It really, it's
not
terribly condescending.
Well, it's condescending, and it's still not addressing the issue or what the guy's bringing up. To say, well, you know, he's a race car driver. Yeah, but he just solved the theory of everything. You know.
Well, you know what it reminds me of is, now that you say it, the contemporary political primaries going on in the United States, where rather than discuss the issues, they call each other names, like whether they were born in the United States or whether they're nasty or things of that sort. This is political speech here, to not address the question, but to dismiss your opponent as a philosopher or a theologian.
I want to wrap up today, Bill, by looking briefly at another article by Krauss, since we're talking about Lawrence. And he has an article called All Scientists Should Be Militant Atheists. This has been in several publications. And let's just get to the gist of what he's saying here. It comes down to the press and the public accusing Lawrence Krauss of being a militant atheist. And he says he's proud to be that. And he goes into some political things here, but I think it gets down to, on the second page, on the third paragraph, J.B.S. Haldane wrote in 1934, "My practice as a scientist is atheistic," the biologist J.B.S. Haldane wrote in 1934. That is to say, when I set up an experiment, I assume that no God, angel, or devil is going to interfere with its course, and this assumption that has been justified by such success as I have achieved in my professional career. I've heard this so much, you know, there can't be a God because God could interfere with our laboratory results and our field studies and things like that. So is he just making a plea here for methodological naturalism?
Yes, that's what Haldane is talking about here.
Yeah.
It's methodological naturalism. But that's not to say that metaphysical naturalism is true or that atheism is true. He's simply saying, as a scientist, I assume and am looking for natural causes of natural phenomena. And that's my methodology, that's my assumption when I do science. Well, many Christians would be wholly in agreement with that that's the way they do science. And that doesn't imply atheism or the truth of metaphysical naturalism, that the world is a naturalistic place and that there is no such thing as God.
You know, I'm trying to recall what Rob Coons says about this, and I think it boils down to, and definitely I want to get your take on it. He says, we have no reason to think that the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, would interfere with our lab experiments and our field studies. I mean,
Right.
why say that?
Well, when you look at the Bible, you find that miracles wrought by God are always accompanied with some sort of prophetic word, and the miracle is an attestation of the prophetic word. Think of the miracles of Moses in Egypt around the Exodus, or think of the miracles of Elijah or Elisha in the Old Testament, or the miracles of Jesus. They're always coupled with an interpretive word that goes to explain what's happening, and the miracles occur in a religiously significant context, and actually relatively rarely over the centuries that are covered by the biblical narrative. They are primarily grouped around the Exodus and the life of Jesus in the Old and the New Testaments. which are events of tremendous revelatory significance, where God is bringing a new revelation of himself, it's not as though God is tinkering with laboratory experiments to secretly bring about different results. And it's precisely because we can assume that God has created the universe with a rational order that science is possible, and you can make inferences about natural causes from natural effects.
Yeah, and it has nothing to do with the existence of God. I mean, if God broke your test tube, caused your test tube to break, well, then God exists. So it has nothing to do with the question of God's existence. It's just some kind of a theological, hair-splitting thing.
Right. The other interesting thing I found about this article is that, again, Krauss is equivocating on terms. What he means by a militant atheist, Kevin, is very different from what that term normally means. It comes out in the last paragraph of his article, where he says, "We owe it to ourselves and to our children not to give a free pass to governments that endorse, encourage, enforce, or otherwise legitimize the suppression of open questioning in order to protect ideas that are considered sacred." And he says, if that's what it means to be a militant atheist, then no scientist should be ashamed to adopt the evidence. Then no scientist should be ashamed to adopt the label of a militant atheist. Well, now, what Krauss is saying here is that a militant atheist is someone who opposes governmental attempts to suppress open questioning because of religious ideas, which is absurd. That's not what militant atheism means. Moreover, it's not what Christians endorse. No Christian thinks that the government should be involved in suppressing open questioning of ideas because they're religious. This is a ridiculous straw man. What Krauss is really after here, frankly, Kevin, is, once again, he's gone outside his field of physics, and just as he tries to do philosophy in dialogues about why is there something rather than nothing, here he's going into politics and constitutional law, and he is arguing, frankly, against the free exercise clause of the Constitution. He doesn't want there to be accommodations to people because of their religious beliefs. So, for example, if there's a military draft to go to war and you're a conscientious objector because of your religious beliefs, Krauss is saying don't accommodate those religious beliefs. If the government says that health care means providing or paying for abortions for your employees, and you decline to do that because of your religious beliefs, he says the government should not make accommodation for religious beliefs. I wonder what he would say about tax exemptions for churches and church-owned properties like hospitals and so forth. There again, the law, because of the free exercise clause in the Constitution, makes accommodations for religious persons and organizations. And honestly, I tremble to think what would happen if people like Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins got political power in our country. I think we would see abuses of the free exercise clause on the part of these kinds of politicians who would no longer make accommodations for religious belief in a free society. So that far from supporting a free society, I think Krauss is tyrannical. He is someone who would not respect the separation of church and state, but use the means of the state in order to inhibit the free exercise of religion. And I find that a terrifying prospect.